Chapter 1. Dr. Hesselius relates how he met the Reverend Mr. Jennings. The Reverend Mr. Jennings is tall and thin. He is middle-aged and dresses with a natty old-fashioned high church precision. He is naturally a little stately, but not at all stiff. His features, without being handsome, are well-formed, and their expression extremely kind, but also shy. I met him one evening at Lady Mary Haddock's. The modesty and benevolence of his countenance are extremely prepossessing. We were but a small party, and he joined agreeingly enough in the conversation. He seems to enjoy listening very much more than contributing to the talk, but what he says is always to the purpose and well said. He is a great favorite of Lady Mary's, who it seems consults him upon many things, and thinks him the most happy and blessed person on earth. Little knows she about him. The Reverend Mr. Jennings is a bachelor, and has, they say, £60,000 in funds. He is a charitable man. He is most anxious to be actively employed in his sacred profession, and yet though always tolerably well elsewhere. When he goes down to his vicarage in Warwickshire, to engage in actual duties of his sacred calling, his health soon fails him, and in a very strange way, so says Lady Mary. There is no doubt that Mr. Jennings' health does break down in generally a sudden and mysterious way, sometimes in the very act of officiating in his old and pretty church in Kenlis. It may be his heart, it may be his brain, but so it has happened 3 or 4 times, or oftener, that after proceeding a certain way in this service, he has on a sudden stopped short, and after a silence, apparently quite unable to resume, he has fallen into solitary, inaudible prayer, his hands and eyes uplifted, and then pale as death, and in the agitation of a strange shame and horror descended trembling and got into the vestry room, leaving his congregation without explanation to themselves. This occurred when his curate was absent. When he goes down to Kenlis now, he always takes care to provide a clergyman to share his duty, and to supply his place on the instant should he become thus suddenly incapacitated. And Mr. Jennings breaks down quite, and beats a retreat from the vicarage, and returns to London, where, in a dark street off Piccadilly, he inhabits a very narrow house. Lady Mary says that he is always perfectly well. I have my own opinion about that. There are degrees, of course. We shall see. Mr. Jennings is a perfectly gentlemanlike man. People, however, remark something odd. There is an impression, a little ambiguous. One thing which certainly contributes to it. People. People think, don't remember, or, perhaps, distinctly remark. But I did, almost immediately. Mr. Jennings has a way of looking sidelong upon the carpet, as if his eyes followed the movement of something not there. This, of course, is not always. It occurs now and then, but often enough to give a certain oddity, as I have said, to his manner, and in this glance traveling along the floor there is something both shy and anxious. A medical philosopher, as you are good enough to call me, elaborating theories by the aid of cases sought out by himself, and by him watched and scrutinized, more time at command, and consequently infinitely more minuteness than the ordinary practitioner can afford, falls insensibly into habits of observation, which accompany him everywhere, and are exercised, as some people would say, impertinently upon every subject presents itself with the least likelihood of rewarding inquiry. There was a promise of this kind in the slight, timid, kindly, but reserved gentleman who I met for the first time at this agreeable little evening gathering. I observed, of course, more than I set down, but I reserve all that burden on the technical for a strictly scientific paper. I may remark that when I hear speak of medical science, I do, as I hope someday to see it more generally understood, in much more comprehensive sense than his generally material treatment would warrant. I believe the entire natural world is but ultimate expression of that spiritual world from which and in which alone has its life. I believe that the essential man is a spirit, that the spirit is an organized substance, but as different in point of material from what we ordinarily understand by matter, as light or electricity is, that the material body is. In the most literal sense, a vesture and death consequently, no interruption of the living man's existence, but simply is his extrication from the natural body, a process which commences at the moment of what we term death, and the completion of which at furthest a few days later is the resurrection in power. The person who weighs the consequences of these positions will probably see their practical bearing upon medical science. This is, however, by no means the proper place for displaying the proofs and discussing the consequences of this too generally unrecognized state of facts. In pursuance of my habit, I was covertly observing Mr. Jennings with all my caution. I think he perceived it, and I saw plainly that he was cautiously observing me. Lady Mary happening to address me by my name as Dr. Hesselus, I saw that he glanced at me more sharply, and then became thoughtful for a few minutes. After this, as I conversed with the gentleman at the other end of the room, I saw him look at me more steadily and with an interest which I thought I understood. I then saw him take an opportunity of chatting with Lady Mary, and was, as always is, perfectly aware of being the subject of a distant inquiry and answer. This tall clergyman approached me by and by, and in a little time we had gotten into conversation. When two people who like reading and know books and places, having traveled, wish to discourse, it is very strange if they can't find topics. It was not accident that I brought him near me, and led him into conversation. He knew German, and had read my essays on metaphysical medicine, which suggest more than they actually say. This courteous man, gentle, shy, plainly a man of thought and reading, who moving and talking among us was not altogether of us, and whom I already suspected of leading a life whose transactions and alarms were carefully concealed, with an impenetrable reserve form, not only the world but his best beloved friends, was cautiously weighing in his own mind the idea of taking certain step with regard to me. I penetrated his thoughts without his being aware of it, and was careful to say nothing which could betray his sensitive vigilance, my suspicions respecting his position, or my surmises about his plans respecting myself. We chatted upon different subjects for a time, but at last he said,